Hello and welcome, everybody. My name is Courtney Doggard. I'm the president of Network 2020. It's a pleasure to welcome you to today's discussion on Tunisia, democracy, and the legacy of the Arab Spring. So a lot to dig into here today, especially with the news that Tunisia has appointed a new Prime Minister, the first female in the Arab world, Najla Boudin. So maybe we'll get to that at some point in the discussion. But we're very pleased to be joined with Professor Safwan Masri and Sarah Yerkes. And I apologize, Sarah, if I just butchered your last name. So with that, just a few words about Network 2020. We are a New York-based nonprofit organization. We're really focused on bridging the gap between the private sector and the foreign policy worlds. We do this in a number of ways. We have programs like these that are available to people throughout the world where we're discussing key topics in foreign policy. We run research, which I'll talk a little bit more about momentarily. We do programs. We're running a deep dive on China, so please do check out our website, social media for more information about some of the work that we do. I am going to interject briefly here before we introduce the speakers to talk about one of our programs that we're recently launching, and that's our entrepreneurial diplomacy program on Tunisia. And we will be focused on Tunisia as part of this program for the next 2 years, which is really a qualitative research program. We have 3 wonderful fellows who will be joining us for this project. We have Leah Maschella, Dario Vasquez, and Pashea Nuxmalo, who will be part of our team helping to do the research. And we also have an on-the-ground advisor, Badis Karboul, in Tunisia as well. So welcome to them. They will be part of our team, and we're glad that they'll be helping us out with this endeavor. Really quickly, we are actually looking for an intern to help with this program and one of our programs on Southeast Europe. It's a great way for someone who is getting started to kind of dig into this content on Tunisia and also on Southeast Europe and entrepreneurship. So if you know of anyone, please do pass along this opportunity. With that, over to our wonderful panelists. So we have Safwan Masri, who's at Columbia. He runs their global centers and global development. He wrote a fantastic book, Tunisia, an Arab Anomaly, following the Arab Spring, and it really dug into some of the reasons why Tunisia went on the path that it did. And so I think he will provide some really interesting commentary today. And we also have Sarah Yerkes, who is at Carnegie's Middle East program. She has a lot of experience in government, both on the security side and in State Department with policy planning, and knows the region in and out, and can also provide a lot of perspective on how US policy is shaped. So thank you both for joining us today. It's a real honor to have you here. I think, Tunisia, it's a small country. We don't always talk about it unless it's something like the Arab Spring, but I think it is a very important country to talk about. So I wanted to start off by kind of setting the scene a little bit. It was the only democratic success story to emerge from the Arab Spring. But of course, the events of July and subsequently President Kais Saied's announcement that he will rule by decree calls all that into question. So Sarah, could you tell us how did we get here? What caused the events in July? Were they inevitable? And was Tunisia really a success story, or is that just us seeing what we wanted to see?
Thank you so much for having me. I'm glad we're able to have this conversation because Tunisia is really, I've always found it interesting, but it's become a really dynamic, interesting place to be examining. But, I think kind of setting the stage for what happened in July, Tunisia has been in crisis for some time, really, well before the July events. And they were facing at that time 3 simultaneous crises: a political crisis, an economic crisis, and a health crisis. Politically, after the most recent elections, which were at the end of 2019, they faced the most polarized, most fractured parliament they'd ever had. And the largest party in that parliament, the Islamist Ennahda party, only held a quarter of the seats. And so all the rest of the parliament was kind of split between a lot of smaller parties. On top of that, you had some really more extreme parties come into power on opposite sides of the spectrum for the first time. And this got to the point where, you literally had members of parliament in fistfights in the halls of parliament.
Wow.
Just shows you kind of how
Okay.
dangerous and sort of how vicious this got. Then you add to that the president and then the prime minister, who the president had handpicked, basically have been at war with each other since day one. And so as a result, you had this situation where there was really little, if any, governing getting done. And Tunisians rightfully were really angry and frustrated at what they saw as this really corrupted, ineffective political class. Economically, the country was just really never able to recover from the revolution. It never kind of made the economic gains it needed to make. So when you look at like most of the socioeconomic indicators, people today are worse off than they were in 2010 when they actually went into the streets fighting for socioeconomic inequality and dignity. None of that was really realized. The situation was actually starting to improve in January, February 2020. They were starting to have some real economic growth. They were predicting their best tourist season ever, but then the pandemic hit. And COVID, just decimated the tourism sector, which is a really important part of Tunisia's GDP. And it did all the other harm to the economy that we've seen around the world, which leads to the third crisis, which is the health crisis, the pandemic. So Tunisia initially actually handled the pandemic incredibly well. They really shut down the whole country. They actually had robots patrolling the streets in some areas to make sure people didn't leave their houses. Yeah, it was a very innovative way to address it. And it was very successful. In the first several months of the pandemic, you had some of the lowest case numbers globally. And I'll tell you, I was actually in Tunis right before the pandemic, as it was kind of breaking out. I left on March 1st of 2020. And I was really shocked or interested to see, I should say, that everyone in the Tunis airport, all the workers, all the employees were wearing masks. And this is something, that certainly no one in the United States was doing. And so, initially Tunisia took this a lot more seriously than some other places. But as summer started to hit, June, July 2020, they opened up the country. And, I don't fault them for this at all. They really were trying to get that tourism sector going, trying to bring in tourists. But what happened was they ended up with a really brutal second wave of COVID. And then you fast forward a year to this summer, and as the rest of the world was getting a decent handle on the pandemic, Tunisia was skyrocketed to be the worst country in Africa as far as COVID cases, and one of the worst in the world. They had hospitals that were just really overwhelmed, completely ill-equipped to handle the numbers of cases, and very little access to vaccines. So this is the backdrop for July 25th. You have people that are angry, they're frustrated, they're hopeless, they feel like they have nothing to lose. They want some way out of the crisis. And the president took advantage of that situation to carry out to what seems to me to clearly be a coup. But to get to the other parts of your question, was it inevitable? I would say yes and no, that anyone who was paying close attention to the president since he was elected could have predicted this. He wasn't shy about what he wanted to do or his desires to kind of totally change Tunisia's political system and concentrate powers in the presidency. He's always had a total disdain for parliament. And I don't think we should be surprised by the path he's taken. He basically told us he was going to do this all along. However, it wasn't inevitable that Tunisia would get to him, I guess, that they would end up with this populist president who would try to undo 10 years of democratic gains. And I think, Tunisia, we should remember, they may have made tremendous political progress, particularly in the areas of free speech and free expression. You have a very strong civil society, a very strong free media, which are still in existence today, despite all the crackdowns. You have a progressive constitution that has these mechanisms set up to defend against exactly what the president's doing, which is why he suspended the constitution in the first place, or I guess in the second place in his second round of efforts, because, at this point, the things he wants to do, he can't do under Tunisia's democratic processes and institutions. So he's had to really kind of shut them down. So just to finish, I guess, I don't think that we were wrong to call Tunisia a success. I think it has been a success. It was certainly a work in progress over the past 10 years. But I really hope that what we're seeing is just a blip on the path towards full democratic consolidation rather than a shift towards full autocracy. I'm not sure. I'm getting less optimistic every day. But Tunisians have done this before. They've kind of pulled democracy off the brink in the past. And so I think the story is still unfolding every day before our eyes.
Thank you. I'm going to shift around a little bit. I want to talk, Saffron, now about where Tunisia sits, right? Because no country's in a vacuum, and this is certainly the case for Tunisia. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what some of the regional influences are at play in Tunisia and how much of a factor were they in this situation, and what's at stake now? How do you see some of the regional players acting?
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Courtney. It's great to see you. Great to be here with Sarah. And it wasn't that long ago, I guess a few months ago, when you had me on another webinar where we were marking the 10th anniversary of the Arab Spring, right? And celebrating the fact that Tunisia had actually, emerged from those revolts back 10 years ago with a with a path on a path towards democratization. And I think it's fair to say that over the past 10 years, it's been very difficult. And I think, Sarah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, you've got three sort of areas that came together: the political, the economic, and the health crises that brought about July 25th. So if I may, let me start there and comment a little bit on what Sarah has shared, and then talk about the regional, because I think this is all interconnected. I think the interesting question is, why have Tunisians reacted the way that they have to the power grab by Sayed on July 25th? And I think it is the total frustration with the inaction by the government and its utter failure on dealing with the health crisis, but also successive governments unable to deal with the economic woes of the country, right? And the political infighting, as Sarah pointed out. Nahda has the largest seats in parliament, but a very small number of seats, and then everything else is scattered. And the one of the things that we've celebrated, that I've actually commented positively on about Tunisia, is a double-edged sword, and that is consensus building and the culture of compromise. That consensus building and culture of compromise has really produced a political stasis, right, that has kept things without sort of deprived it of the ability to move forward. Now, you asked about the regional influences, and that is, I think, related to the question that you just asked Sarah as to whether we should have expected this. Tunisia was unimportant on the regional and the global scene until 2010, 2011. And I think that that is one of the things that has helped it transition to democracy, right? It has helped it be on a path that is different than most of its neighbors. Small country, geographically, situated sort of, close to Europe, far from the center of power within the Arab world and inter-Arab intrigue, no natural resources, really not that important. So no meddling in it. 2011 happens, and all of a sudden it becomes incredibly important to the rest of the region. The experiment with democracy becomes threatening to powers within the region, primarily Gulf countries, and here I mean Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates in particular, who are not interested in having a successful democratic experiment, lest their own people ask for the same. And it sort of dismantles, disrupts a view towards the region and towards power within the region. So I think that, and Qatar, on the other hand, also rumored to be financially supporting Nahda. And so you have the tensions that have existed, the access of Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and in an Arab country, Turkey, on the other hand, backing different sides in places like Libya. in Egypt, and ultimately, the Muslim Brotherhood is thrown out of power. Sisi is bolstered by the UAE and Saudi Arabia. So I think similar sort of proxy and tensions were taking place in Tunisia, and enter Qais Said in 2019. Anybody who studies Tunisia, I think, could see that this is somebody who was incredibly conservative, had authoritarian tendencies. One of the first things that he tried to do was to amend the constitution so that he could place more power within the presidency, declared his opposition to equality and inheritance for women, which a committee under his predecessor had recommended, declared his total rejection of the decriminalization of homosexuality, something that had also been put on the table. And, with his embrace of the Arabic language and Arabic and Muslim values and so on, I mean, it was very clear that this is somebody who was far more interested in bringing Tunisia closer to an Arab Islamic center, which is, I mean, nothing wrong with that, except that I think what has distinguished Tunisia over the decades leading up to the present is that it was never defined, and Tunisians were never defined as one thing at the expense of another. Okay, Tunisia has always been sort of, African, Muslim, Arab, Berber, European influenced, all of those. And in Sayed, I think you saw somebody who was going to be moving it in a particular direction. And, we can come back to this in terms of there's no evidence of anything that's coming in from those Gulf countries. But you saw immediately after July 25th, the expressions of support that have come from Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Egypt. And I think the fact that you would put an IMF $4 billion loan at risk is further indication that you've got other sources that may be coming in to help. Anyway, got on for too long.
Not at all. Thank you. Thank you very much, Saffron. That actually leads nicely to a next question that I have, Sarah, and that's I think one of the reasons why Tunisia's success was so potent, I think, for those of us in the US, was this idea that Tunisia as a success story was sort of proof that Islamist parties could be players within a democratic system. In short, to use that phrase, that Islam and democracy are compatible. And yet, we're often watching examples of Muslim majority countries moving away from democracy. And I'm going to say it's not just Muslim majority countries, we're grappling with issues in our own country. But whether it's through the leadership of an Islamist party, as in Turkey, or through the overthrow or sidelining of Islamist parties, as in Egypt. And so my question to you is really, taking a step back and looking at, what is the role of Islamist parties in democracies? And are we asking a misleading question when we wonder whether Islam and democracy are compatible?
Yes. So I think, I'm not sure it is super useful to ask whether Islam and democracy are compatible, mostly because, I don't think there's anything that's unique to Islam as opposed to any other religion that inherently makes it either compatible or incompatible with democracy. And also, I think it's important to note, Tunisia is more than 90% Sunni Muslim, and pretty much every Tunisian you meet would identify as Muslim. We try to, in the West, we often talk about kind of secular religious divide. It's not really actually a super useful framing when you talk about much of the Arab world. But in the case of Tunisia, no one would really self-identify as secular. But that being said, there is a wide spectrum of views on what role religion should play in the state. The kind of, church and state question that we have in the US as well. Should Islamism be part of the political system? Should there be, Islam as a source of civil law and all of that? So I think, the bigger question for us to look at from the Tunisian case is how religious parties adapt when they're operating in a democratic system. And it's been really interesting to see how this has played out in Tunisia. And I think it's relevant, the case of Tunisia is relevant not only for the Middle East, but also for the West and other places where you have religious parties kind of everywhere. So the Ennahda party that we've mentioned a few times now, which they've been the dominant party really, or at least one of the dominant parties for pretty much all of Tunisia's democratic transition. And it's had to really adapt and moderate itself to survive. We'll see what happens, what the next phase is for Ennahda. Right now, they are really kind of the target of a lot of the president's ire and a lot of the public's ire because they are the one sort of constant with a lot of other political turnover. But interestingly, a few years ago, the party made the decision to change from being an Islamist party. And now if you call it an Islamist party, they'll push back and say, we're not an Islamist party. They voted, they had a party congress and decided to call themselves a quote, party of Muslim Democrats, which I think is really interesting and informative. And, this kind of matches up and very explicitly matches up with, like the Christian Democrats in Germany, for example. So while you kind of have this moderation, and then you could say, well, maybe is there Islamism in Tunisia? But this left a gap there where, I mentioned there's a lot of people who aren't, overtly religious, but there are a lot of Tunisians who do want an overtly Islamist party in government. They want to see a greater role of religion in the state. So while Ennahda was successful in some ways because it moderated itself, you also saw the rise of some other parties to fill in where the gap that Ennahda had left. So in 2019, one of the more extreme parties that I mentioned earlier is what's called the Karama Coalition. So they are kind of a Salafist party, far more conservative and religious than Ennahda, and one of the parties that was getting in fistfights in the halls of parliament. So just, I think, in general, I think there's a lot to look at in the Tunisian case. One of the reasons Tunisia was continually upheld as an important case to study or to focus on for the rest of the world is this question of, can Islamist parties succeed? But I think what we've seen over and over again, as Saffron was saying, is that they haven't done that well. And again, we don't know what the next phase will be for Ennahda, but it seems like one area most Tunisians agree on right now, at least, is that they're happy that Ennahda is not in charge. And so again, we'll see where that goes and what happens in the next phase.
Thank you. That was extremely helpful and enlightening, so I appreciate it. Saffron, in one of your earlier answers, you were talking about, in reference, I think, to your book, about how, about Tunisia's adaptability, and it's sort of, and this is a major theme in your book too, is it has this very unique history. And you talk about in the book how its path to where it is today was really paved by actions that were taken generations earlier that really provided fertile ground, whether it was education reform, women's rights, religion. Looking ahead, do you think that, how do you think that those factors will play into Tunisia's future? Do you think that this is a blip on the road? Where do you see Tunisia heading? Are you optimistic given its rich and unique history?
Yeah, so it's really difficult to be optimistic, Courtney. I mean, and I'm an optimist by nature, and I've always wanted to be incredibly optimistic about Tunisia. And, I think you develop sort of a romantic relationship with the country, the more that you understand it and you understand its history, especially if you come from the region and, somebody who grew up in Jordan and found in Tunisia, the realization of a lot of potential that I had seen in a place like Jordan back in the late 60s, early 1970s, and you see where it is today, socially, in particular, and in terms of the role of religion. So I want to be optimistic, but I'm finding it very difficult to be. And, on the one hand, yes, many of the ingredients that have helped Tunisia get to where it is today will help safeguard it in the future. And I would say, the advancement of women's rights and the role of women in society. And, so the fact that Sayed has now picked a woman, which is a first in the Arab world, to form a government, is a good thing, all else being equal. I don't know enough about her, and I'm not sure, whether she is the right person to form the government, and we will we have yet to see. Civil society, I mean, it's always been incredibly important in managing Tunisian affairs. And that's a big difference, for example, between people ask, is Sayed Sisi, and is what we're seeing in Tunisia what we have seen in Egypt? And I'd say yes and no. I mean, in Egypt, the military is far stronger, far bigger, has a much more hegemonic role, both in terms of the politics and the economy of the country. And Sayed doesn't come from the military the way that Sisi did, right? And on the other hand, you have a very active civil society in Tunisia. Education, you mentioned, the quality of education has been deteriorating in Tunisia, and even though the values that underpin an education system continue to be quite different than they are in other neighboring countries. So, I mean, in sum, I think many of those factors will continue to be that it will help safeguard Tunisia in the future. I think Tunisian women, for example, will see to it that the gains that they have made over the decades are not going to be compromised, right? They're not going to be lost. On the other hand, as we've said, as both Sarah and I have said before, I think in Sayed, you have somebody who is a populist, who's interested in having a one-man rule. I think the fact that one of the failures of the revolution and the new constitution is the inability to put together a constitutional court is really, we're paying the price for that now, because there is no arbiter sort of constitutional power in the country. And it all depends, I think, on the extent of regional influence. And this is something we really need to keep an eye on, because if that indeed is the case, and if indeed he is bolstered by Gulf funding, then there is a similarity also with the situation with Sisi, which is, I mean, Sisi is becoming increasingly popular, and at least in terms of traditional economic metrics, Egypt seems to be doing a lot better. So,
can I come in on this one as well, Courtney? So I agree with everything that Safwan had said. I just want to add a couple of other factors that I think will help or have helped keep Tunisia sort of on its path before and could help kind of bring it back. And one is the role of the military, which has been a really important actor because it's been completely apolitical. And so there have been a few tests during the past couple months of, that's one of the factors I think we should be paying a lot of attention to, is does the military step out of its traditional role as an apolitical actor? So far, I think they've managed to, for the most part, stay in their barracks and stay in their lane, but it's something to watch. And then also, I think on this idea of who is going to protect the democracy, I mean, I think the civil society and media that I mentioned earlier are really crucial actors here. I mean, Tunisian civil society is incredibly impressive, and they are the ones who I think can make or break the transition. And what we've seen with the president's announcement last week or the week before about suspending most of the constitution, the stuff he doesn't like, that was kind of a red line for a lot of people. I think we saw a lot of the political parties and civil society actors who were giving him the benefit of the doubt, or willing to say, okay, we agree there needs to be a change. Let's see what he's going to do. Once he announced that, once he said, oh, you know what, I don't really like most of the constitution, we're just going to put that on hold and I'm going to rule by decree, you started to see the dominoes fall. And you saw a lot of political parties speak out, but also the main labor union, the UGTT, who's incredibly powerful and has 1 million members, can, if it wants to, can really mobilize. And then also some of the more prominent human rights organizations, both local and international, who issued a pretty powerful joint statement recently. So I think, these kind of red lines are there and people are watching. The question is, going to this prime minister, why did Said suddenly decide to appoint a prime minister when people have been asking him to do this for months? Why did he appoint this person? And me, again, I'm also an optimist, but I've become so jaded over the past 2 months that I think, for me, I see it as a distraction, that it's not a surprise that on Sunday there were thousands of Tunisians in the streets calling this a coup, demanding that Said return Tunisia back to normalcy. And then 2 days later, he appoints a prime minister. I don't think that's a coincidence. And the person he appointed is a woman who, it's fabulous she's a woman. I think it's amazing. It's another thing Tunisia should be proud of. But this is someone who has no political experience, has no governing experience, has no economic experience. And so, I want to give her the benefit of the doubt, and hopefully she'll be able to tackle the challenges that Tunisia faces. But, the final factor of this is that he did all of this under a system that's not, with no functioning constitution, no functioning parliament. He's not allowed to appoint the prime minister unilaterally. So none of this is really, we should be proud to see it, the first woman prime minister in the Arab world, but put the rest of that aside and just realize that there's also a lot of challenges that they still need to deal with, I think.
Right, and we want to have the right kind of prime minister who's a woman. Yeah, I mean, I think Sarah, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, he's an opportunist. I mean, this is something that's fits into his pattern of behavior. You've got the protests. So I think a lot of it is window dressing. I mean, and this was not, Courtney, a person who held any senior positions or had relevant experience. Again, I want to give her the benefit of the doubt, and I hope that she does succeed. But this was somebody who was sort of in the Ministry of Education, related to World Bank projects, and did not have any kind of significant profile or experience. And who knows, maybe that'll be to her advantage.
But it sounds like it's not encouraging. But we shall see.
Well, I mean, even if it were encouraging, even if she were fantastic, as Sarah just pointed out, I mean, he made it clear that he is going to be ruling by decree. So the prime minister is at his pleasure.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Before we turn to the Q&A box, I wanted to get one more question in, and I wanted to talk about the role of the US. Sarah, just from your seat in Washington, where do you see US policy on Tunisia? It's a country of 12 million people, like we talked about before. It didn't have great significance in most people's playbooks prior to 2011, 2010, 2011, when obviously we can show the power of a small country. But why should we care now? And what do you hear coming from Washington?
Yeah, well, I think, first of all, that there is a really important role for the US to play in helping Tunisians preserve their democratic gains. And I think, interestingly, the US has really taken the lead on that front since July 25th. They had a little bit of a rocky start with a couple of pretty lukewarm statements. But, when you compare what the US has done in the past 2 months relative to Europe, the US has been far more kind of aggressive. There have been several high-level delegations, including the Deputy National Security Advisor. The head of AFRICOM was just there yesterday or the day before. A congressional delegation called from Secretary Blinken. And you've really actually had a rather forceful pushback from the US Congress on Tunisia, kind of questioning whether Tunisia should get a blank check when they're not really doing the things we're asking of them, and they're not really abiding by the sort of values that our relationship is built on. So, all that said, I think that there's a lot of reasons why the US cares about Tunisia and should care about Tunisia. And the biggest one, or the first one, is that the US has invested billions of dollars in Tunisia's democratic transition. And so, it's in our interest to see that progress continues. I mean, partially for the values argument that we care about democracy and we want all the people in the world to experience democracy, but also, this is a country that really up until July was a very strong US partner that had these shared values. Tunisia is a major non-NATO ally, has an increasingly strong and effective security services that we partner with, that, Tunisia is really very capable at protecting itself from external threats these days, and has been a country that's had a lot of goodwill towards the United States in a region that doesn't always have a lot of goodwill towards the United States. But then I think, this came up earlier in one of Saffron's points, that Tunisia is also really in a critical location. I mean, this is a country that is at the crossroads of Europe, Africa, and the Middle East, on NATO's southern flank in the southern Mediterranean. and is sandwiched between Libya, that's making some progress, but is coming out of years of brutal civil war, and Algeria, who's undergoing its own transition and a lot of uncertainty. So it's in the US interest that Tunisia, in this crucial location, maintains some stability and maintains itself as kind of this little island of stability that it's been. And I think, it's also important for us to remember that just a few years ago, Tunisia was the #1 contributor of foreign fighters to ISIS. This is important. The conditions that we have been talking about today, the economic distress, the political chaos, anger, frustration, these are all the same factors that feed right into the hands of the jihadist recruiters that were very successful a few years ago. And I think, it's clearly in the US interest not to let that happen again. There's also this idea, of our relationship with Europe, and the further instability in Tunisia has a really direct impact on our friends and allies in Europe, and particularly through increased irregular migration. So, I think I spend a lot of my time sitting in Washington trying to convince people in the State Department and depending on other places that Tunisia is something we should be paying attention to. And I think that, it's a country that a lot of Americans aren't familiar with, but does actually have real implications for the United States.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to the Q&A box as with a reminder to everyone who is listening. If you'd like to ask a question, please put it in the Q&A box and we'll see how many we can get to. I want to start on one of, jumping off from one of the last questions or that you answered a while ago where you're talking about your lack of optimism. And so someone is asking, both of you have mentioned that you have little optimism for Tunisia's future. What active steps need to be taken in the short term for signs to point more positively? So Saffron, I'll start with you on that and I'll give you a crack at it too, Sarah.
Thanks. So I'll start where Sarah left off, and that is by coming out of the United States and Europe, the right kind of policies towards Tunisia. Not putting Sayed on notice. Sayed rode a populist wave, frustration, totally understandable, justifiable frustration with the failures of successive governments to deliver on economic needs, right? And then exacerbated by the COVID health issues. So if we make it difficult for him to deliver on what he has promised to deliver in terms, and unless he gives up the power and reverses some of his actions, then I think that's one thing that we absolutely must do. The problem is that when you talk to people, and Sarah is in Washington, she talks to people all the time, they'll agree with you about how important it is to help Tunisia continue to be on the path towards democracy. This kind of talk, you've heard from secretaries of state and from presidents, Obama and so on, since the revolution. The problem is, as the US ambassador to Tunisia told me in 2015, the then US ambassador, everybody agreed with him, but then they were distracted by the other bigger issues. Egypt was far more consequential, the way that they saw it than Tunisia, although, Tunisia, not only because of its geographic location, but, what Sarah just said about sort of feeding jihadist groups, feeding on the kinds of issues that you have there. So I think that's one, the role that Europe, the United States can play, especially if it is a role that sort of balances or overcomes what I consider to be a sinister role coming from further east. I think we have yet to see also the kind of pressure that civil society is able to mount. They've done it before, and we'll see how that goes on. But let me just stop here. Sarah, you want to add?
Sure. So I think the first step, if you'd asked me this 2 months ago, I would have had a very different answer. But I think looking at reality and what I think this president is doing and trying to do, the first step is to hold new elections. So if you're serious that you think all these things need to be reformed and whatever, hold new elections. get people in parliament, get it going. Second step would be to have the constitutional court. So make as the number one thing that this new parliament does is put into place a constitutional court. The third thing would be if you want to have constitutional referendum, if you want to revise the constitution, amend the constitution, set up a committee that parliament helps pick, and that and civil society helps pick. So it's not just the president handpicking a few people to come up with some sort of process that involves public input into having a constitutional referendum. And then the other piece, which is kind of the irony behind all of this, is that they haven't implemented most of the original constitution. So implement the constitution. A lot of what President Said is really interested in is decentralization and sort of devolving power to the very local level. They have a 27-year decentralization process for which they've done very few steps so far. So start with that. They need to have elections for basically their governors, have those elections, elect the governors, start to implement some of the laws and the regulations that are already in place are very good. They haven't been implemented. So I think there's a couple of very practical things that can be done. None of them are easy, but if you're serious about reform, you do this. I don't think he's serious about reform. I think he wants to keep the power in his own hands, but there are things he could do if he actually wanted to move Tunisia forward.
Just to follow up on that, I mean, you're talking about some measures that were already in place that hadn't been implemented, and was that because of this infighting that you were talking about earlier? Like, what were the reasons that they weren't implemented, and how, and in this ideal world where President Said decides that he's willing to kind of give back some power, how do you avoid going down that road again?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it's this consensus model that Saffron mentioned earlier that, on the one hand it really helped Tunisia get over some of its really early challenges and really painful challenges to the transition in like 2013, 2014, but then prevented anything from getting done. So there was never a lot of agreement. The idea behind consensus should be people take more risks because you have multiple parties with opposing interests who agree on something. They should be then willing to, as a coalition, to kind of do the hard stuff, but they haven't been able to do that. And there's a lot of that in the economic sphere. But then the decentralization stuff, even gender, there's a really progressive gender-based violence law that's on the books that has had very little implementation. And that's a lot due to like lack of knowledge, that they haven't trained police officers and judges on what that looks like. So there's a lot of different pieces to what needs to be done. I mean, as a constitutional lawyer, as the president is, he's well placed to actually sit down and study the Constitution to say, these are the things that maybe do need a little bit of a nudge. It's been 10 years, maybe we should adjust a couple things. And these are the things that are okay, but we need to implement that. I'm very skeptical any of that will happen without the sort of pressure that Saffron mentioned from the international community and from civil society. But there are steps that he could take.
Yeah, I mean, I think on the Constitution, for example, let's not forget that this was a constitution that was drafted over a 2.5-year period almost. You had the Constituent Assembly that was elected in October of 2011, and the new constitution that was adopted in January of 2014. And during that time, you had committees upon committees and constitutional law experts debating and fighting, and you had protests on the streets and Nahda trying to push a certain agenda, and women marching to oppose it, and there were public debates, and of course, after a few years, there is room to improve upon it. Of course, there should be opportunities to amend it, but he wants to do this single-handedly because he is the constitutional law expert of all experts, and he knows what's best for the country, and that's the attitude that he's carrying with him.
We're getting a couple questions on the economy. And so, Sarah, I'll start with you. And again, Saffron, if you'd like to chime in, please do. I mean, obviously, the economy was one of the drivers of the original Arab Spring. There wasn't a lot of recovery. But Sarah, you mentioned that, or I think, or Saffron, I forget who mentioned that things were sort of on the right path, in the right direction finally when the pandemic hit. So I'm going to, do a multi-part question there, pulling in some of these different questions that we're getting. So, how can Tunisia achieve some more economic development? And how were they doing that before the pandemic hit? Like what was sending them in the right direction? And then how could the US help Tunisia to be more economically empowered?
Sure. So one of the biggest challenges that the economy faces is a huge public sector wage bill. This is a country, this is not unique to Tunisia, but it's a country where, there's a lot of, I guess, attempt to buy social peace by giving people public sector jobs. So one of the big drivers of the revolution was high unemployment, particularly youth unemployment. And so one of the easy answers for that is to just give people jobs in the public sector. Tunisia, I haven't checked lately, but at least prior to the pandemic, had one of the highest public sector wage bills in the world. So this is something where this is something the IMF pushes on every single year to say, you need to reduce your public sector wage bill, but you have this really powerful labor union that I mentioned earlier, the UGTT, who's the general labor union, the union, for the public sector workers, who has been used all of its power to basically push back. And time again, you'll have, prime ministers or someone, the former Prime Minister Youssef Shahid was really trying to tackle this and push back and said, okay, we're gonna, have lower retirement age. We're gonna try to kind of buy people off, get people out. And then the UGTT pushed back, and they ended up getting like a raise for public sector workers when the whole goal was to push back. So that's just one cycle that keeps repeating itself. Another piece of this, so that we haven't talked about at all, which is a huge part of the Tunisian story, is corruption. This was another major factor that led to the revolution. Ben Ali was a kleptocrat. I mean, his wife in particular and her family stole billions of dollars in assets from the Tunisian people. So this has been President Said's main issue, is fighting corruption. So there is a lot that can be done there. That's, there's issues of transparency, of, trying to address both petty corruption. There's, regular bribes of police, of doctors, of all of that. That's just something that's become normalized in a way that people see it as the cost of doing business. But then there's the graft, the kind of bigger corruption that President Said says he wants to address, but so far all he's done is kind of throw people in jail that are opposed to him. So I do think a real effort at addressing corruption would be helpful. And it's something that, the US and Europe have been trying to be somewhat helpful with, and also with further private sector investment. Europe is much more economically tied to Tunisia than the United States is, but there have been more attempts at sort of pushing for additional private sector investment to try to help and provide jobs and job training and the education system as well, which all of these things are kind of interrelated.
Yeah, let me add to that, if I may, Courtney, and say that Tunisia's economic problems did not come about after the Arab Spring. Okay, I mean, and many of them are generations old. They're decades old, and some of them are structural in nature. And you've got, for example, for a couple of hundred years now, a dichotomy, if you will, between the coastal region and the interior region. You have a reliance on informal trade, and which accounts, by some accounts, for 50% of the economy. And there are two schools of thought, that it does produce economic benefits to those who participate in it and the communities that benefit from it. But on the other hand, that means you collect less taxes, less money flows through banks and so on. So let's not forget that also under Ben Ali, when the economy seemed to be going well and the IMF and the World Bank were trumpeting Tunisia as a middle-class economic miracle, between 1990 and 2008, the country averaged 5% GDP growth. Something like 80% of that growth was concentrated in the coastal regions, right? So by some economic measures, Tunisia was doing very, very well, but an average Tunisian in the heart of the country was suffering. And in 2008, you had revolts that, one can argue were perhaps the real beginning of the Arab Spring in Gafsa. Corruption, as Sarah mentioned, was also a very, very big component of this. So I think since the Arab Spring, which, the revolution promised a reversal of the economic situation, a reversal of corruption, right? I mean, and that has not happened. Okay, that's where the failure has been. So I do think that things have become worse since 2010, 2011, but not that much worse. I mean, they were not that great to begin with, right? So that's one point I wanted to make. The other one is what will be very, very interesting is that for a populist president like Sayed, if he were to go the international donor organization route, the first thing that he would have to do is cut that huge public sector wage bill that Sarah put her finger on, and cut subsidies, right? Fuel and food subsidies and so on and so forth. He's not going to do that because that would be totally antithetical to everything that he has used as an excuse to accumulate the power that he has, which makes me sort of further convinced, again, not on the basis of any evidence so far, that he's counting on an alternative source of funding that would enable that. The final point I'll make about this is that in terms of what needs to happen in Tunisia, infrastructural development, particularly in the interior of the country, really, really important, and education, not reform, but rather a total rethinking of the education systems in Tunisia. Under Ben Ali, there was a popularization of education. Okay, it was sort of the floodgates were opened, and I think the problem that you have in Tunisia today is that you've got an over-educated population that's not well educated. Okay, everybody has a degree, at least one degree, but not necessarily in the right field that would help them prosper economically, and not necessarily a degree that really translates into a good education. So, I mean, this is a much larger subject, but I just wanted to flag it as something that's really part of the problem. Every time we talk about unemployment amongst the educated, one has to think about, the fact that you've got an oversaturation of degrees in the marketplace, and not no match, or sort of a mismatch between qualifications and what the market demands.
Fascinating. Thank you. Sarah, we're having a question about the popular opinion of Tunisians. And whether or not there is any enthusiasm for democracy in the country. So what are you hearing? I mean, obviously you've talked a little bit about a shift over the past few months, but how has that predated the events of July? And where do you see overall public opinion?
Yeah, there's been a tremendous amount of public support for democracy. Obviously with the revolution that brought that in, but up until July 25th and after July 25th, I think, the majority of Tunisians want democracy. What the shift has been more that people understandably are prioritizing like their own personal needs. Democracy hasn't delivered the economic growth as we've talked about that people want. So there's been more hesitancy around that to say, all things being equal, I prefer democracy. If you look at kind of public opinion polls, people say all things being equal, I prefer democracy. However, democracy is not exactly delivering what I want it to deliver. But I think that the interesting piece is the support for President Said and what he's done. And he, was vastly popular but when he was elected, but also when all this happened on July 25th, the kind of tagline that I thought was most useful was, is what he's doing democratic? No. Do Tunisians want him to do it? Yes. And so that doesn't mean they don't want democracy. I don't think we should draw that conclusion at all, but they were willing, as I mentioned earlier, to kind of give him the benefit of the doubt. That that support is chipping away, but I still would say that the average Tunisian on the street, if you ask them, they still largely support what he's doing at this point. It's more the kind of political space, the elite actors, meaning civil society and political parties, that are turning against him a little bit, not fully, but a little bit, that we're starting to see a sea change. And I think that it will eventually trickle down to the public, but they're not there yet.
So people want stability, but
yeah,
they also
and they want to be able to feed themselves and their families, which we all can understand.
Absolutely. A question from Joanna Voschowski. Saffron, I'll give this one to you, who asks, what role does France currently play in Tunisia, and what constructive measure could it take given its history in the Maghreb?
So I think, I mean, I'll start, but I'd rather defer to Sarah on that, if you don't mind. You know, she's much more in the foreign policy field. I think so, a couple of things. It's very interesting that President Macron visited Lebanon twice last year. Was it last year? Yes, last year. And it's you know, historically been the case that France has really continued to ensure or try to ensure that its former colonies, places like Tunisia, like Lebanon, that it continued to play a positive role in them. Some analysts have suggested that France wanted to exert its own influence, for example, on Lebanon, and handpick people who would maybe carry the country forward, wanted to pursue its own agenda vis-a-vis competing parties or powers within Lebanon, and failed to do so, and sort of, you know, turned its back and moved on. You know, to the extent that that may or may not be true, I think that France has been, to a large extent, absent from the scene when it comes to Egypt, to Tunisia. Now, there have been, over the past couple of days, some restrictions in terms of immigration and visa, but I'm not sure how much of that is connected to the situation in Tunisia and how much of it is regional, because it does include Algeria, Libya, and others. But Sarah, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. France has obviously a really important relationship with Tunisia. There's a very strong Tunisian diaspora in France. A lot of Tunisians are educated, including the prime minister, the new prime minister. She did her higher education in France. So that relationship is really important. The issue is very important, as we've talked about. What I've heard from conversations with French diplomats is that you know, they don't want to ruin their relationship with President Said. He's someone who, it's become clear, really works, does not respond well to sticks. He responds to carrots. And so there's been a desire, and I think understandable, that France is concerned that if they push hard on him, and that's not just France, most of Europe has taken the same tack, that if they push hard on him, there'll be repercussions. But yeah, I do think it's been a little disappointing to see how little France and the EU have said. One thing to watch for is the Summit of the Francophonie, which is the annual summit of French-speaking countries, is supposed to take place in Tunisia at the end of October, I believe, or November. But this is something that Tunisia has not done a great job of planning so far. But the political piece to this is there's been some reporting that both Macron and Justin Trudeau have not RSVP'd. And so if they don't show up, if Macron does not show up to the summit of the Francophonie, that's a massive kind of middle finger to Tunisia. So I think he is holding that out. I don't know what he's trying to extricate for that, but I think that's something to see. And just even the news of that is important in the France-Tunisia relationship.
Well, thank you both. That really concludes us exactly on time. That was really fascinating. I appreciate both your taking the time, the remarkable insights. I really appreciate it. There's clearly a lot to watch. We will be doing some more briefings on Tunisia as the year goes on, so please do watch this space. So thank you both. Thanks to everyone who was listening and asked wonderful questions. I'm sorry I couldn't get to them all. Our next briefing is on October 14th. It'll be in the evening, and it's with Dr. Yukon Huang, and it will be on China's economy and its global impact. So please do RSVP for that. And one plea, we are a nonprofit organization. If you like our briefings, we're trying to keep these free and open to everyone around the world. Please donate to support us. You can also become a member. We would welcome you with open arms. So thank you for your support. Sarah, Saffron, thank you so much for your time today. Thanks for everyone who's listening. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.